Micah chapter 6 and verse 1 says, Hear ye now what the Lord saith, Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and ye strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord hath a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. O my people, what have I done unto thee, and wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me. For I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt, redeemed thee out of the house of servants, and I sent before thee Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, consulted, and what Balaam the son of Beor answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Amen. The Lord just bless that reading to our hearts there. The picture that Micah has given us here in this passage that we've just read, the picture is of a court of law. And verse 1, it says, Hear ye now what the Lord saith, Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. So Israel is on trial here before the Lord. And remember, Israel are God's covenant people, and he has a case against them here. And the prophet Micah has been delegated to act as the Lord's spokesman in these legal proceedings. He gives a summons here at the beginning of verse 1 to get his hearers' attention. He says, Hear ye now what the Lord saith. And after giving that initial summons, he tells them then the commission that the Lord had given him. And he says, Arise, contend thou. In other words, stand up and plead your case. As in any court of law, there are witnesses present here, and in this case they are unshakable witnesses. They're the mountains and the hills and the strong foundations of the earth, as we have it there in verse 2. And in the presence of these witnesses, the court comes to order. The Lord has a complaint against his people. Verse 2 says, Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, or the Lord's complaint, and ye strong foundations of the earth, for the Lord hath a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. So the Lord has a complaint here against his people, and in court here, the Lord will bring his case and his complaint against Israel. And what is that complaint? What is this case that the Lord is bringing against his people, Israel? Verses 3 and 4, he says, O my people, what have I done unto thee? And wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me. For I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed thee out of the house of servants, and I sent before thee Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So as Israel steps up to the witness stand, God asked them, What have I done to you? What bad or evil thing have I ever done to you? Tell me. The Lord's case was simply that he had done nothing but good for them. All that he had done for them was only good, but they had repaid him with rejection and rebellion. So you get the picture. God had only been good to his people, but they turned around, repaid him with rejection and rebelling against him. For all his goodness to them, they had turned around, turned their backs upon him, and rejected him. So that was the Lord's case that he was taking here against them. What specific goodness does the Lord mention in bringing his complaint against them? Well, he says in verse 4, I redeemed you from the house of bondage, bringing you out of the land of Egypt. Remember the terrible cruelty of the bondage that the children of Israel were in their slavery in Egypt. They were whipped, they were beaten, their lives really were like a misery. And that's what God is telling them here. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, you were in a miserable condition, but I redeemed and delivered you out of that terrible condition. When you could never have delivered yourselves, when you could never have saved yourselves from that slavery and from all that your slave masters were doing to you there as they cruelly treated you, you could never ever have saved or redeemed yourselves, but I stepped in and I redeemed you out of that terrible situation. Nehemiah could say to the Lord in Nehemiah 1 verse 10, these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power and by thy strong hand. So the Lord had shown his great power. We know the story, sending the plagues upon Egypt, and by his great power the Lord had redeemed and delivered his people out of Egypt. And then he had given them godly leaders, as he says there at the end of verse 4, Moses and Aaron and Miriam. How good God had been to them. He had been more than good to them, but they had rebelled against him, despised him and his laws, and that's why God is here taking a case against them. I've been so good to you, redeemed you, delivered you from Egypt, and you could never have delivered yourselves, but now you've turned round, rebelled against me, despised me. You know, I wonder tonight, could the Lord take a case against us? He has been so good to us. In fact, as we think about it, God has done nothing but good for us. God has never been bad to us. He's never done us any harm. He has only done good to us. And what greater thing could God have ever done for us than redeeming us by his great power out of the slavery of Satan and sin? And every one of us can look back to that time when the Lord stepped into our lives, and whenever he reached down by his mighty grace and reached down his loving hand and rescued and saved us. He had sent his son to the cross to die for us, to pay the price of our redemption. And in time he reached down and lifted us out of the slavery of sin, where we were controlled and dominated by sin, where sinful lusts and desires were controlling us and bringing us down to eternal death and indeed down to hell itself. And we could never ever have delivered or saved ourselves. But God, at the infinite cost, the cost of sending his son to the cross, who suffered and bled and died for us and paid the price of our redemption, he has redeemed us and delivered us out of that slavery. And here we are tonight, the redeemed of the Lord. How good God has been to us. But how often do we turn round, live for ourselves, live for our own glory instead of his? How often we sin against him and despise his clear commands? Could the Lord rightly take a case against us tonight, just like he did with Israel here? Been able to state how good he has been to us, but how we have turned round and rebelled against him. The Lord's case against Israel here was strong, and they were guilty here in the prophet's court. The Lord goes on to say in verse 5, O my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, consulted, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. Notice here twice in these verses, in verses 3 and 5, the Lord addresses his people as, O my people. O my people. Now that's significant. What the Lord is doing here as he's stating his case against his people is he is emphasizing the bond that existed between them. These weren't just any people. These were his people. He had a friendly, loving relationship with them. That made their guilt even greater. Because the Lord had this loving relationship with them, they were his people, and now they had sinned against him and turned against him, that made the case against them even greater, and their guilt even greater. Now, the fact that we are God's people tonight, that he has this loving, living relationship with us, that puts a greater onus on us, doesn't it? It makes it all the more grievous whenever we do go our own way, rebel against the Lord, and do our own thing. That makes the Lord's case against us even stronger. He has saved us. He has brought us into this loving relationship with him. He can say of us tonight, "Oh, my people, you're my people, but look at what you've done. You've turned against me." That makes his case against us even stronger. Verse 5, again he says, "O my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, consulted, and what Balaam the son of Beor answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord." We have the story of Balak, the king of Moab, and the prophet Balaam recorded for us in Numbers chapter 22 to 24, and I'm sure we're all familiar with that story. The king, Balak, the king of Moab, he wanted the prophet Balaam to curse Israel. He saw the children of Israel coming. He perhaps was afraid that they were going to destroy them as a nation. And in his fear, he caused Balaam, the prophet, to come and to curse Israel. After meeting with him, Balaam prophesied over Israel 4 times. But in those prophecies, as he spoke God's word, rather than cursing Israel, he blessed them every time. It was as if the Lord prevented Balaam from cursing his people. And each time, all 4 times, instead of cursing them as Balak wanted them to do, he ended up blessing them. Of course, this infuriated Balak, but in the end, and here's the point that's being made here, in the end, Balaam did give an answer to Balak as to how he could see Israel brought under a curse. And it was not through having a prophet coming and pronouncing a curse on them, but rather the way it would be done was they, the Moabites, would lead the children of Israel into deliberate adultery and fornication and idolatry. And then as a result of that deliberate disobedience against the Lord would then curse them. And that's exactly what Balak did. He sent his young women into the camp of Israel to lead Israel into sexual immorality and idolatry. And then because of this great sin, God did curse them. You read the story in Numbers 24. He brought a plague of judgment on them at that time that killed 24,000 of them. So why did God bring this incident up here as he is stating his case against the children of Israel here? The reason why he did bring this incident up here was he wanted them to remember that he could never be persuaded to curse Israel. No prophet, Balaam or any other prophet, could ever persuade God to curse his people. Never. But what happened was they brought the curse of God upon themselves by their own deliberate disobedience. As Balak led them through, the young women there, led them into idolatry and into fornication and so on. It was because of their deliberate rebellion against God, their idolatry and their disobedience, that God then had to curse them. And here in the prophet's courtroom here, God was making it clear to Israel that the curse that they were experiencing was entirely their own responsibility. He says that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. The Lord was absolutely righteous in cursing them because they had deliberately rebelled against him and rejected him. In other words, it wasn't the Lord's fault. It was entirely their own. And you know, whenever we come to a place in our lives where we're not experiencing God's blessing, where we're not knowing his hand upon us, where we're not knowing his presence with us or knowing his blessing upon us, where we're facing perhaps his disfavour on our lives, that's never ever God's fault. Never. God would never just curse us as the king of Moab here wanted Balaam to do. God would never just pronounce a curse upon us as his people, but by our deliberate rebellion against him, by our own deliberate actions, we can cause God's disfavour to come upon us and experience the lack of his blessing upon our lives. But it's never God's fault. It's always our own. How did the people then answer the Lord here? Look at verses 6 and 7. It says, wherewith, this is the people answering the Lord here in court, wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000 of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Whenever Israel asked here, with what shall I come before the Lord? It wasn't because they were genuinely wanting to know how they could come before the Lord. But rather they were asking this question out of bitterness and resentment. Israel was calling out to God from the witness stand, what is it you want from me? In verse 7 they said, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000 of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? David Guzik, a commentator, said, we can almost hear Israel shouting at God from the witness stand, you ask too much, God. Nothing will satisfy you. If we brought thousands of rams, or rivers of oil, or even my own firstborn, it wouldn't be enough to please you. You are unreasonable. That's basically what Israel was saying here. Why did Israel respond like this? Why did they feel that God was being unreasonable? They felt like this because they were blinded to the goodness and to the character of God. They were failing to see the goodness of God to them, and that's why they were having these feelings of resentment, feeling that God was demanding too much of them. They were reasoning through their own depraved minds, through their own depraved thinking. God is not a mean dictator who just delights to demand as much as he possibly can from us. God had been so good to them as he had just reminded them. But they were turning around and saying, God demands too much. God must change, not us. You see how depraved their thinking was in regard to God? They didn't see that the fault lay with them. They were almost resenting God and feeling that God was demanding too much of them. You know, it's easy to condemn Israel here and say they were so wrong to think like that. But you know, are we any different at times? At times, I believe we've all been there, I know I have. At times we are blinded to the goodness and to the character of God. We forget the goodness of God. You know, we sing that hymn, Count Your Many Blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. And we fail to do that, don't we? So often we get so focused upon the hardships of the Christian life and how difficult it is to walk with God. And we forget, or we're blinded to the goodness of God and how good and how God has blessed us in so many ways. We forget that. We think that God demands too much of us, or he's too hard to please. We may not say it, but our attitude is, what is it that the Lord wants from me anyway? I wish he was less demanding. I wish this Christian life didn't involve having to take up my cross daily and follow Christ. I wish there wasn't as much sacrifice involved. Now, if we're all being honest, I believe we at times feel like that, don't we? We may not say it in words, but we feel like that God's asking too much here. Instead of focusing on the goodness of God and the privilege to give back to God our lives and all that we have in the light of all that he has done for us, instead of focusing on that, we think the Christian life is too narrow and God demands too much of us. What was the Lord's reply here to Israel? In verse 8, he said, He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. So in the prophet's courtroom here, God stops the shouting of the angry defendant from the witness box. He as much as says, you act as if what I require of you is some mystery. But the reality is, it's no mystery at all. I have shown you very clearly what is good and what I require of you. And he says, is to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. It is as if the Lord answers this controversial witness in open court saying, what I require of you isn't so complicated. And it's not. What the Lord requires of us, the sacrifice and the obedience that he requires of us, it's not really that complicated when you look at it. And God tells Israel here that there are just three things that he requires of them. They were thinking that God was demanding too much from them. God tells them that there are just simply three things that he requires of them. Firstly, to do justly. That is to act in a just and a fair way toward others. Just treat others the way that you yourself would want to be treated. And that's a good rule to live by, isn't it? And the second thing is to love mercy. Don't just show mercy, but love to show mercy. Let it be the greatest desire and longing of your hearts to show mercy to others. And then the third thing is to walk humbly with thy God. And that really sums up the Christian life, doesn't it? Walking humbly with God. Pride is our greatest downfall. It was the downfall of the devil there at the beginning, and it's something that we all constantly battle with. It's something that trips us up over and over again, pride. And God simply requires of us to walk humbly with our God. He said to Israel here, just remember who I am. I am your God. And if you keep that constantly in mind, you will live and walk humbly before me. And if we were to keep before us who God is, the reality of who he is, then I believe that we would walk humbly before him. There would be no room for pride in our lives. Spurgeon said, humility must be in the heart, and then it will come out spontaneously as the outflow of life in every act that a man performs. Through humility is thinking rightly of thyself, not meanly. When you have found out what you really are, you will be humble, for you are nothing to boast of. May God help us all to walk humbly with our God, realizing who he is, realizing all of his goodness to us, and how good God has been to us, just realizing that from day to day, and then just living in the light of that. Living in the light of God's great goodness to us, all that he is to us as God. He is our covenant God. The God has redeemed us, brought us back to himself. And as we realize that, then we will walk humbly with him and serve him. May God help us and enable us to do that in all of our lives, wherever we're at, wherever the Lord has us, wherever we're serving him, that he might help us to walk humbly with him.